Hello, I'm Linda Elder, the president of the Foundation for Critical Thinking. I'm here with my colleague, Dr. Gerald Nosich, who is a senior fellow with the Foundation for Critical Thinking. Welcome, Gerald.
Thank you, Linda. I'm glad to be talking with you again.
We are coming to you from the, as I've said, Foundation for Critical Thinking, which is a 501c3 nonprofit organization in California. This is January the 28th, 2022. We are focused in this series on the analysis of reasoning going deeper. And in this particular session, we're focused on questions in reasoning, part 2. And in a minute, I'll remind you of what we did a bit in part 1 of the question series. In the overall series, we're asking ourselves, how do we better understand this part of reasoning? How do we go deeper in this part of reasoning? And I will point out here that no one has fully explored the analysis of reasoning. No one has fully plumbed purpose in reasoning. No one has fully plumbed questions in reasoning, information, implications. So there's a lot of theory that could still and should still be developed within these elements. In part 1 of this series, we focus just briefly on the questions that emerge from each of the elements of reasoning themselves. So we explored that a bit, and we explored questions that emerge from intellectual standards a bit. And we began to explore questions that emerge from intellectual virtues. And we'll go back to that when we focus on our later series on intellectual virtues. In this session, we're going to explore other ways of using the concept of questions in reasoning. And we're going to see how by making certain conceptual moves within questions, we have more power in our thinking. Now, before we begin to explore these different angles, or some of these different angles further, I want to point out that questions is unique as an element of reasoning, as they all are unique. But it's unique in that, for one, we don't have developed theory of questions. And in I believe 1965, it might have been 64, Richard Paul was writing his first dissertation, and he focused on questions. Gerald, you'll know this, of course, and because we've worked with that dissertation in working with Richard. And I wanted to start with that because you will remember in working with that material, that first dissertation, which, by the way, was rejected. And it was rejected by the Richard's dissertation committee, basically, I think, because they didn't understand it. But it was also because it was highly exploratory. And Richard was trying to figure out, how do you categorize questions in different ways? And what moves can you make within questions that will help you reason better? And so for example, he was talking there about clusters of questions, and he was pulling together what we already knew theoretically about questions. And I remember when we worked with Richard on that dissertation, Gerald, you'll recall this, it was difficult for us because it was very complex and somewhat maybe, as I said, exploratory. It was highly detailed, and we didn't really have categorical moves at that point that were easily made based on the detail he was working in. But one of the things I remember clearly was clusters of questions. So so we could start there. So we can think that we can realize that questions occur in clusters, and we can categorize these clusters in different ways. But one of the examples I was thinking of was, for example, when you think about your health, if I say, think about your health, your physical health, what are the questions that you ask about your health? And when you answer that, we're going to have a cluster or some clusters of questions, right, that are interrelated. So clusters of questions are interrelated, the way that clusters of concepts are interrelated. And you could say, couldn't you say clusters of purposes and clusters of information and clusters of implications? So that's just one early move I was thinking of. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, yeah, I guess what makes them clusters primarily is relevance to, in this case, health, for example. I mean, that strikes me just off the top of my head as the thread that makes the cluster a cluster. It's not just association. Oh, this brings up another thought.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. And note the concept of as I was saying, I was sort of becoming more and more clear. So I meant physical health. So that's a concept. So the concept, when I ask the question, the larger question focused on that concept, we have clusters of questions that emerge.
Yeah. And one other thing I can say about the clusters of questions, it's different, much more psychological or pedagogical or something like that. And that is, in my classes, I often had my students work kind of extensively on asking questions. And many times students would have no questions at all to begin with. And even if I gave points, they had, some of them couldn't come up with a question at all. But then what happened is, once questions started to come, other questions emerged and other questions emerged, and that prompted other questions. Oh yeah, well, let me ask about that. I never thought about that before. So that the clusters kind of developed out of the process of questioning. It's not just out of the process of questioning, it's the promoted process of questioning, meaning this is what our inquiry actually is about asking questions. It's not about taking notes on the information that's being given in class.
Yeah, that's why it's very sad that we don't, when we look at young children, look at a 4 or 5-year-old that's been appropriately raised, let's say given the basics, it's had its basic needs met. This is a child that's going to have a lot of inquiry, asking a lot of questions, has not been told not to do that yet. And it's just asking questions and asking questions and asking questions. And then so the mind naturally does that. You see, we know that from that data, of which we have much. And so therefore we know the human mind is perfectly capable of doing that. And if you can do it very well when you're a 4-year-old, whatever your IQ level, then why can't you do that well? I mean, many times better as an adult.
Yeah, and one of the things that goes against it, this is now not about clusters or the logic of questions so much as it's the kind of the culture of education, probably not just education, but where as students mostly are, students are mostly acculturated to taking down information, to listening, at least in the sense of writing the lectures down in the notes. And it's a culture that where questioning just doesn't arise. I think it doesn't even arise in your own mind unless you're primed for that ahead of time, or unless that's promoted. Yeah.
Right. That's why. But once we do promote it, actually it promote it, not just say that we're promoting it. Right. But we actually promote it in the classroom, and for that matter, anywhere else. When it's promoted, it does begin to generate new ideas and new questions. Right. So this is very much related to internal motivation, but also external conditions for questioning, for the allowance of questioning, right? So there are a lot of things we don't ask because we're really not allowed to ask them in our societies.
Right. And in some, my understanding is that in some cultures that there's a definite prohibition against asking questions. I had a Liberian student in my class, an older gentleman, and he just had a very hard time because it was considered very disrespectful to ask a question of the authority. And I have also worked with at least one group of Native Americans. I've been told that other Native Americans have the same kind of thing, but where questions are seen as disrespectful. And I have to confess, I don't know quite what to do about that, because you can't within your culture safely go around being disrespectful, even if by my lights the actual activity you're engaged in doesn't show any disrespect at all.
Well, the sad thing is that to the degree that you're not able to question fully, you're not able to think.
Right.
Freely.
Yeah. Right.
Because if you cannot ask questions that you actually are seeking the answer to, that means you don't have the answer.
Right.
And you're not allowed to ask it. So how are you going to, how are you going to get a satisfying answer if you get no answer?
Right.
How are you going to grow, and is your mind going to expand?
Right. Yeah. I mean, I mentioned Liberian and a group of Native Americans, but the same thing holds for people in the culture in a classroom as well. In that, in my webinar the other night, we were talking about questions and the importance of raising them and everything. And one of the participants said that she's one of those people who asks questions, and she'll ask a question, say in a classroom of the instructor, and then she'll have another question and she'll ask that one. And pretty soon she starts being looked on by the other people in the group as, what are you doing this for? They're just massive disapproval. And sometimes that comes from the teacher as well, because the teacher wants to cover the material, and here you are taking up time by asking your questions. And so there's this, it's not formally enshrined in our culture to frown on questions. In fact, we say the opposite, but in practice, it often is frowned upon to ask questions or to ask too many. I could say one of my favorite illustrations of this or something like it is if you watch war movies or police drama movies. So in the war movie, the colonel will stand up and turn in front of 30 soldiers and they'll say, we're going on this operation and your group goes over here to the left, you circle around behind, you go up over here, you do this. And the colonel will talk for 15 minutes about the plan, and then he'll say, are there any questions? And no one raises a question. I'm sitting there thinking, I got a ton of questions. My life is on the line about this, so the lives of all these others. What if it doesn't go right? What's our plan B? What if I mix up left and right? I mean, and I've actually talked to people in the military and a few police, and they say that's not just movies. That's what actually happens when someone when the colonel gets up and tells you the plan. So I think that it would take a great deal of intellectual courage in a meeting of being one of 30 soldiers where the colonel is giving you the plan to raise the question, well, what do we do if this goes wrong? I think that would be seen often as obstructive, as not being part of the team, whereas to me, it makes you a better part of the team.
This is why intellectual autonomy is so important.
Yeah, right.
So if we encourage the development of intellectual character, then a person is in a situation like that, is able to first of all say, okay, here's my real question, and second, is it safe to ask it?
Yes.
And that's right. So you have to be able to make both of those moves, and you've got to make them well.
Right.
So then I think that students asking questions of the teacher is in a kind of situation like the one you were mentioning in class a few minutes ago, is it illuminates for me one of the problems, one of the reasons why we're not advancing critical thinking very much in education is because we're not placing questions at the heart of teaching and learning. We are still placing content, undigested content, at the heart of teaching and learning. So we still have massive amounts of lecture going on, decades after we've known it doesn't work.
Right.
And I mean, the research has proven it. We've always known it for hundreds of years if you were paying attention. But some people need the actual, scientific data. Okay, it's been for decades, but we're still thinking that we can just cram ideas into students' heads. So my point is that until students are generating questions regularly in the teaching and learning process, we're not going to be able to move very far in human societies, because we don't know how to ask good questions. We wouldn't know, we don't know when we do have a good question, we don't know how to break that down into other questions. We don't know what moves we can make with that question. We aren't using the right standards for approaching the question. And questions is just, 2,400 years after Socrates has just been swept under the rug. Yes, Socratic questioning, we like that, but what does that mean to you, and how are you engaging in it? All right, so I'll let you to come in to get a word in edgewise here, Gerald.
No, I wanted to say, I think in many ways that lecture is the opposite of questioning in pedagogical terms. And so I wonder how it is that so many people could believe in lecture or engage in it so completely, given all the evidence that it doesn't work, and the evidence even before we did empirical analyses of it. And it's and as I think about it, it's because lecture does sometimes work. The way it works is if it's something you already know a huge amount about, and now you hear somebody else who also knows a huge amount about it, but has a somewhat different point of view, and you're able to think your way through it. And I think that's the role that most professors are in, most instructors are in. That is, they know their area really well. And so it seems as if just explaining it clearly conveys it to the other person. Whereas in fact, what conveys it to the other person is having a question, having the question answered or responded to at least partially, and then raising another question and working out your difficulties or your misunderstandings or the gaps. So I think there's a mechanism that makes lecture still so prominent.
Yes, I'm glad. Thank you for that qualification. So there are certain cases where a lecture is perfectly appropriate, but these are going to be areas, and now connecting it to questions, where, as you've implied, if not stated, the people involved in those high level lectures are asking, when they walk in, a whole host of questions. We've got these questions going on in the back of our mind. Now, what do you add to that? Okay, I'm making that move. I'm making this move. I'm making that move. Now, lecture still may not be the best way to even teach in those situations. It doesn't mean that it's the best way, but that's very important for people to see. So if you're lecturing to students without these skills, then they're not making any of these moves, and they don't know how to make them. So how are you teaching? How are you going to connect these great ideas that you have to these students that are asking no questions and just are asking when this class is over? So this is connected to the idea, the important idea, again, that thinking is driven by questions. If you have no questions, there can be no understanding. If you have no questions, you're not asking any other related questions because you don't have the first question. You're not in the room of learning in this content if you don't have any questions. So that is why Richard always opened his classes with, "What are your questions?" And that doesn't mean I'm going to answer them. It means I want to know what they are. And because when you tell me your questions, then that I can assess to a large degree where we are in the content. So go ahead.
No, I was going to say, and there are many mechanisms for that, because sometimes students just don't want to say the questions out loud in class. But I think I may have gotten this, either this technique or the idea for a similar technique from Richard, and that is just pass out a very quick survey. Which of the concepts in class are clear to you? Which of them are unclear? Which of them are in the middle? And in effect, it's generating questions, because now they have to say, okay, is this concept clear? Is this concept not clear? And they can just check, so I can get a quick rundown of what they're understanding, and that's related to questioning.
Yes. Right, because every time you have one element, you have the others. That's why if you're really focusing on, well, let's say you're focusing on concepts. In other words, what are the concepts you've learned at this point in the classroom, in the class? Then when you articulate those concepts, then your articulation implies questions.
Right. Yeah.
Okay, so we've talked just a little bit about the complexity of questions. We just touched on the concept of clusters of questions, and that idea has not been fully developed. But you get the idea. Like you could say here's an assignment for you, for all of us. So you could say, what are the cluster questions most prominent in your life? So then I could say, let's go back to physical health. So if your physical health is important to you and you spend energy on that, so you exercise, you have an exercise plan that's well developed or somewhat developed or whatever level you are, right? And then you really think about the food that you eat, you think seriously about it, you have my body is my temple kind of mentality about what you bring into your body. You see, so all of these particulars I'm talking about now would be personal to a given individual.
Right.
And so I could say, so that's one part of your life potentially that entails a cluster of questions that you're asking and that you're pursuing. And then what's another one? Let's say your career. Be another example, and then your intimate relationships or your parenting, right? So you have these rooms in the house of your mind, and in those rooms are question clusters.
Yeah, and I want to say just the move you just made. I was looking away to write it down. You began by saying, if health is something that's very important in your life, what are the clusters of questions around it? And stepping back from that just one step, it just seems like a very good question to ask. So what are the most important ideas in my life, the most important concepts in my life? You then went through a number of them, and but that's a very unusual question for a person to ask about her life, right? What are the most important parts of it that I can question? What are the most important concepts that I revolve my life around? And now, what questions do I have about those? Yeah, that's a deep sort of question. It goes deep into our understanding of things.
And it's these deep and really foundational questions
Right.
that we often, if not usually, as you said, ignore, but that are guiding the quality of our lives and our quality of our future and the way we look at life. And you see the big questions. You could say, what is the big question cluster of your life? Meaning, what are the big questions that are driving most of what you do? And because at the end of your life, you want to be able to look back and say, I lived the life that I would have hoped I could have lived. And that means asking the right questions.
Yeah.
Or not the right questions, but the better of the possibilities.
Right.
Best we can come up with at the moment, given the level of our knowledge, abilities, and emotional well-being at the moment, something like that.
Right. Yeah, the way I might obsess about how to get about a scratch on the side of my car or something like that. And if I step back from that, if I could emotionally step back from that as well, I don't have a scratch in my car, but my car, it wouldn't notice. But hypothetical example. If I could step back from that, I could say, oh, that's really a very minor question as far as the important things in my life. It really is just incredibly tiny.
Right.
Yeah.
I think once you mentioned to me this research that shows that humans are very poor at giving the proper level of weight to a problem in their life.
Right.
That that's always sort of stuck with me. I remember one time I had my I think it was my purse stolen from a car.
Mm-hmm.
And that as soon as I realized what had happened, I started telling myself really strongly, this is not a problem, just an inconvenience.
Right.
This is not a problem.
That's right.
Somebody who's using your credit cards right now, that's not a problem.
Right.
You're going to have to get a new driver's license. It's not a problem.
Mm-hmm.
You're going to have to get a new window. It's not a problem. It's not, but it was feeling like it was.
Right.
Kept on feeling like it was. I kept saying, no, it's not. No, it's not. No, it's not.
Yeah. It's an inconvenience. Right. And, or a set of inconveniences, but not a problem. Right. But that's not the way it feels at all.
Putting things in perspective,
mm-hmm.
keeping things into proper perspective
mm-hmm.
is a very powerful concept.
Yeah. And illuminated by the question, how important is this in my life? How important is this?
Exactly. So then let's turn, so we could obviously get into further discussion on clusters of questions, but now we each have an assignment. We could think about all the main areas of our lives and the main questions we're asking.
Mm-hmm.
And then we've talked about the importance of asking questions, and we've talked about the importance of encouraging the asking of questions. And this is an open-ended encouragement. Mm-hmm. It's not just, okay, now is a question and answer session. Okay, that's it. No, we're not asking questions right now. We're only asking them here. No, we mean that we can ask it whenever it's appropriate. The time has come and I'm, allowed and I can. Then I can ask freely.
Right.
And the more we ask questions, the more we become comfortable with asking questions. And we also see that that we really can't learn without asking questions.
Right.
I want to give just a very quick example. I had a personal example for me when I was a graduate student and I was taking a statistics class. Mm-hmm. My professor was really trying at critical thinking, but he didn't quite have, he didn't have the concepts. Mm-hmm. So he came in and he read something from, I forgot exactly, it was essays that were totally unrelated to statistics. Mm-hmm. And we didn't know why he was doing that. And then he sat on his table, his desk, and he just sat there. He didn't say anything. And what he wanted, we figured out, a bit later, is that he wanted us to ask questions. Mm-hmm. But he didn't know how, right, to say that. And maybe he finally said, so nobody has a question. All right. So then I was looking around. Now, statistics is not really my thing. I mean, I can do it if required, and math is fine if I have to, but I don't really love it. Mm-hmm. But so it wasn't really my favorite class, and I didn't really want to be, like putting my heart and soul into it. But there he was asking for questions, and nobody had one. So I thought, well, I've got at least one, and I'm sure that somebody else in here probably has that same one. So I'll just ask that one. And, so I asked that one question, and then people around me going, yeah, because they're writing the answer. So you see, they had the same question. So then nobody's asking questions. So I asked another question. And so you see, from that, I learned just go on and ask it, because of course I learned it a lot earlier that if you just participate, if you just sort of push yourself forward a bit and say, okay, well, here's a question I have, then suddenly you can ask questions. So you ask it once, you can ask it again. You're going to keep asking. So it builds these skills build, this confidence builds when we just go ahead and take the chance.
Right. And I want to make a little proviso in it about asking questions. And that is sometimes people ask me, or sometimes people draw the conclusion that it's always good to ask the question. And there's a sense in which that's true, but it's not always good to ask the question out loud. That is, there's the question of safety.
Right.
I mean, if you're in Stalinist Soviet Union, there are questions you should not be asking out loud. It's probably good to have them in your mind, but even having them in your mind, you might blurt it out at the wrong occasion. But so there's nothing about asking questions that dictates that those should be asked out loud, and that also includes in class. I once, as a fellow professor, sat in on a course in 20th century music composition, and we're engaged in spelling chords, and the teacher said, okay, you got to ask me about this. The exam's coming up. If you don't ask me right now about what you don't understand, you're not going to do well in the exam. Nobody asked a question. So he repeated it more stridently. You got to ask the question. And the student said, okay, so how do you spell a B flat in a chord? And the professor went, oh, if I've told you once, I've told you 1,000 times. Oh my goodness. So I'm sure he didn't do it consciously, but
right.
If he set the person up.
Got the question, yeah. And then he slammed
shamed in front of the group.
Yeah, those are good caveats. And I implied that earlier, but I didn't absolutely state it. In other words, we need our critical thinking with us all the time.
Right.
And that includes helping us know when to ask a question. And also, when I say you should be free to ask questions whenever you want, that doesn't mean to be obnoxious with your question asking either.
Right.
And I've learned, for my part, in my classes that I've been in as a student, because I've learned that it's you learn more when you do participate, when you do ask questions. I've learned to sometimes just keep my mouth shut and let somebody else talk. Right. So just because you have this great question doesn't mean now's the time for you to ask it, because maybe you're the only one that's had a chance to ask anything. So I was talking about the spirit of question generating.
Right.
Mainly we're not generating good questions.
Indeed.
Right. And so we need all these nuances and caveats that bring in.
Yeah.
So now we can turn to some other theory that we have developed in our school of thought, the Paulian school of thought, beginning with the work of Richard Paul. And we can burrow in a bit to, let's say, any one of them. So let's focus on what we call 3 types of questions. And now, Gerald, would you like to just briefly explain what that means?
Well, there are, we say it in different vocabularies at different times, but one is that there's a kind of question we call a one system question. And that is typically those are kind of matters of fact, or the kinds of things that you could just look up somewhere. What's the boiling point of lead is an example of a one system question. I don't have to do, the only critical thinking I have to do with respect to a question like that is figure out where to look it up. It's just a straightforward question, one system. Another kind is a no system question, and that is, it's a question that doesn't really have exactly a logic to it at all. Sometimes it's like, what's your favorite opera? Well, or I mean, a joke I used to tell long ago is, what's your favorite color? Orange. Wrong. You can't be wrong. I mean, it's just your favorite color. And if somebody even says, well, why is orange your favorite color? There just doesn't quite make sense. You might make up a story from childhood or something like that, but it can just be your favorite color. So there's no system to it. I don't have to figure anything out. There's another way of putting it, where I think of figuring out as a rough and ready synonym for reasoning it out. But then the most interesting type of question from a critical thinking point of view is multi-system questions. And that is where we have to think through relatively complex questions, and we have to approach it from using different ways of thinking about it. If I'm a medical doctor, at least two systems I have to bring is, first, my medical knowledge that I'm bringing to bear, and the whole systematics of the medical knowledge I'm bringing to this patient's problem. But then another system I have to think in terms of, or I should think in terms of, is that patient's psychology, how the patient is going to take what it is I'm going to be saying, and what they're going to be doing about it or not doing about it. And those are very different systems. And that happens very prominently when we combine disciplines with one another. When we have a sociological question which has a biological dimension to it, for example. We have to think it out in terms using different systems, and that gives rise to judgment and judgment answers, where judgment answers can be correct or incorrect, but much of the time they're multifaceted answers with multiple parts, and there may be no hard and fast single right answer. Let me say one more thing about the one system questions, often just classified as factual questions. I like thinking of them as one system more than as factual. But even though those are one system questions, meaning I don't have to engage in critical thinking about them, once upon a time they were critical thinking questions. That is, people had to figure out and experiment to find the boiling point of lead. So before that was known, that was a multi-system question. How do I go about finding it out? How is it related to other similar elements in the periodic table, though they couldn't have said that because there was no periodic table then. So people had to think in terms of multiple systems to come up with the factual answer. So it once upon a time did involve critical thinking, though it's so well established that it doesn't need that now.
So let me come back to that, if I could, and just then recap what you said.
Please do.
And then come back to that in few other examples. Okay, so the way I understand this is that all questions can fall into one of three categories according to this scheme. Either it's as you said, one system question. You mentioned questions of fact. We might also say are questions of procedure.
Procedure, right.
Right. So it may be a complicated procedure, but the procedure is agreed upon by educated users or specialists in the field, depending on the case, or educated thinkers rather than users, educated thinkers or specialists in the field. So if you ask what is the boiling point of lead, and somebody says, well, I think it's like 28 degrees. Somebody else says, well, I think it's, and they just start throwing out numbers. And somebody says, well, let's just, vote on it. Well, then obviously they don't understand the question. Right. They don't understand that is a scientific question, and it's answered in a scientific way using scientific procedures. And those procedures are agreed upon by, let's say, mainstream or the best scientists in the field, depending on the case. So for system one questions, we're looking for the right answer or the right procedure for finding the answer. And when we have the question, then we know what will be, whether we need to consider a specialist viewpoint, or what the question will determine how we find that answer. But we don't have to find it ourselves. In other words, it's found for us. Right. It's been found.
Right.
Now, although I want to just give a slightly different view from the one that you gave, I don't think that every category 1 question falls into the category of that it was once a complicated question. So for example, who is your mother? So that, I know who my mother is. I've always known it. And that is a question of fact.
Mhm.
And now if somebody said later, well, Linda, you said it was a question, you knew who your mother was, but here's your birth certificate showing that that's not actually your mother.
Right.
But I could say, well, when I met mother, when I thought of mother, I was thinking of the one who raised me. So that's my mother, no matter what paperwork you show me. But anyway, my point is that there are a lot of questions that didn't have to be proven by someone. They were questions that we know by implication. And these fall into category 1. Some of these are category 1 questions.
Right. And I think I would approach it a little differently, though I do take the case of the motherhood one, but one system questions that have, let's say, a right answer.
Mhm.
Giving the wrong answer, there's still one system questions.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
So if you in fact had a concept of mother that meant the person who raised you, the woman who raised you, if you in fact had that ahead of time, then I'm saying you're exactly right. But for many people, they have just a concept of mother which doesn't distinguish biological from the person who raised me. So there's a way in which the concept of mother is kind of ambiguous, but either side of the ambiguity, biological or the person who raised me, has a single right answer,
Yes.
which can be established. Yeah.
Yes, once you say that this is the use that I intend by this question,
Right.
then
One system, right.
Right.
Yeah.
So but then also I want to just build on that. So where your point is very important about questions of fact, first needing to be treated as questions of judgment. Take question like, what is the cure or the best cure, or what is a cure for AIDS?
Right.
So there may be a cure. There hasn't been a cure yet, I don't think, but that basically it's much better. But let's just say, right. So I'm not sure exactly the status. I know there are medications that make it so that people can live maybe a normal lifespan if you have AIDS, but that's not the same thing as a cure.
Right.
So what I'm saying is that if you take the question, what is a cure for AIDS? Let's say eventually there is going to be one. And when that comes to be, then it will be clearly a category 1 question.
Indeed, yes.
But right now it has to be treated as a question of judgment because we don't have the answer.
Right.
We have to try this and that and this and that and a lot of other things.
Right.
When we've done that, then, and you could say, well, it was always a category 1 question.
Oh, yeah.
But then that's to miss the point. Well, if it's a category 1 question, then we have an agreed upon answer. So what is it? We don't have it. So can't be a category 1 question.
Right.
It can be in the future.
Well, I don't know. There seem two issues. One is, and I'm not sure these are distinct. One is whether it's a category 1 question that is a question, whether it's a question that has one and only one right answer.
Right.
Versus how do we tell? So it seems to me, is there life on other planets? Is a yes or no question. Fully. How do we figure out if there's life on other planets is a different question that involves figuring it out and thinking in multiple systems. But the answer is going to be all or nothing.
Yes. That in that particular case, yes. So is there life on other planets? That's what makes it a little tricky, because although it is a category 1 question, that is it's right, but if we don't know the answer, then we still have to basically treat it as a category 3 are a question of judgment until
Right.
you get the answer.
And I would think abstractly that there's no reason to think that we would know the answer to all category 1 questions, right? I mean, there could,
Right.
right? There could, I mean, I can't see why we would automatically assume that. So it's a kind of
But-
question that's kind of independent of what the actual answer to it is.
Well, I think in that case, it has to be treated as a category 3 question. So, because if we take a question and we're going to categorize it, and we ask these questions first, do any facts bear upon the question that a reasonable person would have to consider? And then if the answer is yes, and it's not a question of preference, so we can't just say what we like, right? Just, well, I think it's orange. No. So you have to, so are there any facts that bear upon the question? So if the answer is yes, it's not a category 2 question or a question of preference. So it's either a question of fact, let's say, or procedure, or judgment. And now, the next move is, do the facts converge into one agreed upon way of looking at the facts?
Right.
If the answer is no, then it's a category 3 question.
Indeed, judgment question. You're right. Yes.
It's a question of judgment.
Right.
Right. And the 1, 2, 3 don't matter, right? Those are just arbitrary. It's it's just an easy way to, once you've studied the theory, to be able to say it's a category 1, 2, or 3. Category 1 is one system, category 2, no system, category 3, multi-system. So, or a question of judgment. We're moving in and out of this language, so hopefully that's not too confusing.
Right.
So those moves that I just made are essential, because if there's not an agreed upon way of looking at the facts, and you can say, what do you mean agreed upon? Well, I'll go back to what I said earlier. If it's having to do with educated usage, then we ask, well, how do educated persons look at this? Not how does anyone look at it? Not what is any view, however vulgar it may be. No, how do educated persons look at this? Or how do specialists look at this? Not disregarding how educated persons would look at it.
Right.
So that is very important. So then, did you want to?
Yeah, I was going to say, I like the word convergent in there, in that if I ask a question like, how can I best get along with my brother-in-law? That's inherently a multi-system question, meaning it's not agreed upon, is probably not going to enter in because it's about me, but there's not going to be any one definitive answer. I'm going to be, I can do this on this occasion and this at this occasion, but it's not even occasion oriented. It's going to be a multifaceted approach, which isn't going to be a question of procedure or a question of fact. So it's never going to converge to a single point. Whereas many questions like the AIDS one might in the future converge to a single point if we do find a cure for it, right?
Yes. So then to kind of to sort of recap then the whole and move a bit more to preference and judgment. So questions will fall into one of these categories. So a question of fact or procedure, a question where you can just say your preference, or a question of we're requiring reasoned judgment. Somebody might say, well, wait a minute, are you sure that covers all the questions? Well, what other questions are there that don't fit? And I would say, well, you could add, if you want to stretch this, you can add metaphysical questions.
Right. Yeah.
So, but then you could just say that a metaphysical question is a multi-system question too, right? So, right. So a metaphysical question is not a question of preference or fact, because it's being metaphysical. It's beyond our understanding, right? So in any case, questions beyond our understanding, if you want that category, we can add a fourth. But questions beyond our category, beyond our understanding, Well, what do you do with those? So go ahead, Gerald.
Can I ask you for an example of what you mean by a metaphysical question?
Is everything well, you could take the ultimate question of how did we get here, like anything. How did anything arrive in the world, in the universe?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So then you go to the established sort of arguments. Everything, either everything came from nothing, everything always was, or everything came from a supreme being.
Mm-hmm.
So, which is another way of saying everything came from nothing, I think. Anyway, everything came from nothing. Everything always was, or everything came from a supreme being. None of those make sense logically. So you could almost say, well, it's just eeny, meeny, miny, mo. But people come up with reasons to believe any one of these.
Right, indeed, yeah. So it's not just eeny, meeny, miny, mo. It's not just what happens to come into mind, but it's not as if, yeah, I don't know what else to say except to say that it's not as if we get some enlightenment about the question, but it's not as if we advance very far toward answering it. What we often find is that there are incorrect answers, but as with almost all questions, I mean, sometimes people say there's no right or wrong answer to this, but I think that's wrong. There are almost always, as far as I can tell, wrong answers to questions, even if there's not only one right answer. So, yeah. So,
well, what people, and now you're bringing in another big subject, and that is the concept of relativism. And in other words, people who believe basically that all questions are questions of preference. In other words, you can just say anything you like. Right. You have your opinion, Gerald, I have mine. So we just sort of disagree. Okay, then well, depends on the case. You know what? So are we going to disagree on whether the world is round or flat? So okay, you think it's flat and I think it's round. So let's just toss a coin. Or
yeah.
No.
Let's agree to disagree.
So, yeah, no, that
makes no sense.
Right. It makes no sense. So there, and people, let's just take the way that people treat the COVID-19 vaccination. You see, they're using this argument, well, you got your opinion, I've got my opinion. And one of these opinions is deadly, and the other one is basically benign.
Right.
But you see, and there, people aren't able to make basic moves, like to say, look, I don't know anything about vaccinations. Let's start there. Except that we've all had them, and they've kept people from dying in many cases. You know, I mean, these people have vague knowledge of vaccine. We get our animals vaccinated, we get our children vaccinated. We were vaccinated as children, but beyond that, it's, you know, like a vague way of thinking about it in many cases. So then now there's a lot of propaganda out there about vaccinations being dangerous and being pushed by the politicians who, or that Bill Gates is trying to put a microchip in all of us. It's going to come through the vaccination. I mean, lots of people believe that sort of thing. Wow. And so then but these people cannot make these basic moves. They cannot say, again, I know nothing about vaccinations, except this little bit. I see all this stuff, you know, it's floating around here, all this information. But it seems to me that this question, should I get a vaccination, is fundamentally a scientific question.
Yeah, right.
So if the politicians are saying this and they're saying that, that shouldn't really be relevant to me if it's a scientific question. Why should I be asking what the politicians think? Any of them. Right. I'm going to ask, what do the best scientists think who know something about vaccinations? Now, even then, we have to have some trust, I mean, at some point. But you see, these are very fundamental moves. is it a scientific question or not? If it is there agreed upon answer? Now, the vaccination was a little messy in its rollout because we had people die that shouldn't have had to die, and some of the vaccines were better than others.
Yeah. Well, as you know, I'm very interested in history, and it's just interesting that when Jonas Salk came up with the first polio vaccine and it started sweeping through the country, I don't know if you know who Walter Winchell was, but he was the most influential media person in the United States on all the radio programs during the 40s and 50s and on television in the 50s. Extremely influential. And even if you don't know who he is, you might recognize his voice. He had a kind of staccato voice. And he said of the polio vaccine, of Salk's polio vaccine, this vaccine may be deadly. And a lot of people refrained from getting the vaccine because they trusted Walter Winchell. They trusted him on other matters so much. And a big difference between that and COVID is that one of the reasons his scare did not inhibit the polio vaccine as much as the current vaccines are inhibited is that everybody was already aware of polio. I mean, they were terrified of polio, whereas now there's a lot of denial of COVID or of how bad it is, even though they're all these people have died from it. But there's another thing I wanted to say about this, and that is, to me, I don't want to call it brilliant because it's so pernicious and horrible, but the tobacco companies in the late 70s invented this advertising technique in order to defend cigarettes as not causing cancer. And it's a single phrase: experts disagree. And to do that, they can find an expert somewhere who says something else. And now that's spread all over the place. Experts disagree. So notice that first, it's completely irrelevant. Of course, experts disagree. They're humans. There are going to be some people in any field who don't believe in climate change, even though the vast majority of them do. But it gives people a kind of hook to hang their disagreement on in the face of science conclusiveness.
Yes, that's true. So relativists can always find some angle to justify their absurd relativistic positions. Now, there are times when relativism is relevant. So if you say, well, are you short, Linda? Are you a short person? Well, relative to most other people, yes, I am. You see, so that's relative to one another. One is shorter and one is taller. So a bunch of them are taller. So that's a concept that has use, but it's been misused, and it's been misused to collapse these categories that we're focusing on here. And if you collapse these questions together, and people can just make any move, and they feel that that's as good as any other move, then the game is up, so to speak.
Yeah, and the reasoning goes out the window. Yeah, and relativism is, I think, inherent in one system questions, in questions of preference. Questions of preference are always relative to me, to what I prefer. And so what it does is it takes multi-system questions and assimilates them into what's no system questions. Yeah.
Now, just again to help people understand, so when we think of the one system questions, Gerald gave, what is the boiling point of lead? And let me give just a few others. So what is the size of this room? What is the differential of this equation? What is the sum of any number and any other number? And so these are just some examples. And in every field, there are going to be questions of procedure or fact. So let's just take the field of psychology. So they're going to be, you could say, what is a reasonable way of explaining Albert Ellis's primary concepts? that he uses in his reasoning.
Mhm.
So, because he had core concepts, he used them over and over again. You should be able to articulate this,
Mhm.
and we should be able to say that's accurate.
Mhm.
And you could say, well, that's really a question of judgment. I could say, well, you might stretch it a bit, but you know, if Albert Ellis was standing over my shoulder and I were answering that, I think he'd be asking, is she accurate?
Mhm. Mhm.
And if he's not, I'm going to say, no, that's not a question of judgment. That's a question of whether you understood what I was saying when you read my books.
Right. Right.
So I don't want people to think that these are just questions like in math and science. They're questions that wherever you have an agreed upon a way of articulating it or procedure or answer, where you can apply the standard of accuracy,
Mhm.
then
Mhm.
it's another move you can make.
Mhm.
And then questions of preference, again, just so people are clear, these are questions in which you never have to give your reasoning when you answer them.
Right.
So if somebody says to me, well, why do you like to wear a red shirt? So I say, yeah, I think I like to wear red. Why do you like to wear red?
Mhm.
So, or justify your wearing red all the time.
Yeah.
So, and why do you wear that scarf, that color? You know, so these are questions of preference. Do you like to wear your hair in a certain way? Do you want to be tattooed? Do you
Mhm.
want to wear jewelry?
Mhm.
Now notice I didn't say in that last one, I said, do you want to wear jewelry? I didn't say, do you think humans are justified in mining gold and silver to make jewelry for people?
Mhm.
That's a
Mhm.
different question.
Right.
And I just said, do you want? If I say, do you want? And you say, so if a teacher says, what did you like about the field trip? And you say, not a damn thing. Then you can't further judge them. You ask them what they liked about it. They liked nothing.
Right.
If you said, what did you learn from the experience?
Mhm.
Then that's not a question of preference.
Right. Well, and one thing that makes this confusing, I think, is that people in certain fields like literature often are asking for a question of judgment, but they phrase it as a question of preference. Like, what's your favorite Shakespearean play? And then they ask why. And the question, both questions kind of make sense. It's just they don't really mean what's your favorite.
No,
they mean something much more involving much more judgment than that. And I think it's quite prevalent. So it does. So yeah. So it has to do with phrasing something as a question of judgment, but one that in fact isn't. In effect, asking, what are the reasons for thinking that play is more effective than the other? So it could be a question that's kind of like that. Yeah.
So this is why the way we ask questions is so important. And if you ask for something, what someone liked, they don't have to say anything. They can say nothing. And if you say, what did you learn from that? What do you think is valuable in this? Which is the most important of Shakespeare's plays and why? Then I have a guide for my reasoning if I'm the student. Then you've given me something to work with. But so we need to make sure that we mean when we say, do you want? And when you ask a question, do you want this? You should be able to produce that. So in other words, like if you ask a child, do you want to go to school today? And they say no. You want to get ready right now? No. Then you should be able, if you ask them if they want, then you should be able to follow through on your, let them do whatever they want to do as a result, you see? But if you mean you've got 10 minutes to get ready and get in the car, then that's you should say.
Yeah, and it brings up that other thing, the parental voice just influenced me about this, about how we try to soften things by making them into questions when they're really not a question.
Yes.
Don't you think you should try to get along with your teacher better than you do now, honey?
No.
No, I don't think so.
Get out of that school. I'm coming home at noon.
No, I've
Yeah.
considered that question, and I've decided, no, I don't have any good.
Right. So this is, this just shows the importance of using language with clarity and precision,
Mhm,
and as it were, accurately in context, depending on what you're driving at.
mhm,
So, and I might add that, people will often impose their wants on other people. This often happens in a marriage when it begins to dissolve.
right.
So the let's just say the woman wants to wear a certain dress to a party, and the man starts saying, it's not appropriate. I don't want you to wear that. I don't like that dress.
Mhm,
And so she's chosen something that she wants to wear, that she would enjoy wearing.
mhm,
And it's a question of preference
mhm,
and in her mind. And then, the other person is constantly imposing, or in this case, imposing, and let's
mhm,
say it's a habit. And it
mhm.
can go the other way as well. That's just one case.
Right, right. Yeah.
So if somebody says, I don't like your hair that way, Linda, my question is, well, who asked you what
Yeah, right, right,
to, impose your views on me? And
right.
this is also important to cultural, the cultural arena,
Mhm,
because often, again, cultural relativism, of course, is a problem where we're not dealing with just a culture's preference,
right.
but an ethical dimension of human life.
Mhm,
So in other words, people have a right to do all kinds of things culturally that they want to do. What do you like to wear? Do you want to wear anything? Do you want to wear nothing? Do you want to wear your hair this way? And all these things that you might want to do, they're just having to do with your preference in terms of style. A lot of sexual behavior falls into this category,
mhm.
but not all. And so that's why ethics is so important in knowing when you're dealing with an ethical question or where you're dealing with a cultural question.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, very, very much so. Um, yeah, and what it's okay to do, meaning accepted to do in one culture, can be very different from what it is to do in another culture. And indeed, even two of the things we mentioned before, if you're in that culture, that question may never arise in your mind because you're just so used to dressing the way they do in their culture, or the way we do in our culture. I mean, I can't imagine wearing a Speedo to teach my class. Um, uh, uh, so
If people know what that is.
yeah, it's one of those abbreviated swimsuits, someone told me.
That's what I thought.
Um,
Yeah,
uh,
so if you walked into a class, so I'm imagining you walking into a classroom with 30 to 40 students,
mhm,
and you're walking into the front of the class with only a very slim swimsuit on.
right.
That would not be,
Conducive to education at
no,
all.
I don't think that would be
Right,
acceptable in
right,
that context.
right. And unless something comes up for me, I would never raise the question. So should I wear a swimsuit to class today?
Mhm.
I just wouldn't. So culturally, the question often doesn't arise. And then the other one has got to do with safety, or an implicit unconscious idea of safety. And that is, to a certain extent, I need to, as the swimsuit example shows, I need to accommodate myself to the expectations of others. I can't wantonly be offending people. I don't want to say you can't. I mean, there are problems in wantonly offending people, even if it's legal and ethical.
Well, if this gets into social conventions, let's say,
Right,
and customs.
right.
So now I was thinking, when I was explaining what you were trying to, what I heard you saying, I was imagining now a different scenario where a person is teaching a scuba diving class
Hmm,
and everyone's got swimsuits on.
hmm,
And it's perfectly, if you walked out there with a suit on,
right.
or you see, they'd look at you like, so you were crazy. So the context is to a large degree determining what rules we have to apply to ourselves
Right.
in that situation. So in this dialogue, for example, where there's certain rules that apply, so we have to dress in a certain way, and like we're not eating while we're talking, right? I'm trying to think of obvious examples. We're trying to make sure that everything's quiet on the outside so we can have this discussion. So, and I've got lights here. So now I work with my lights quite a bit. I don't know if they're working perfectly, but you see, so yes, we're trying to make this situation conducive to learning on the part of the listener or the viewer.
Right.
And if we come in with shocking behavior or offensive behavior according to social rules, then they won't be able to learn. But I've taught workshops for, say, like, if, for example, in Hawaii, if you teach workshop there, one of the things that people do is they bring in a lot of food. So they bring in food for everything, and so during the workshop, there's just piles and piles of food on all the tables. And I'm thinking of, working with the content. And that's a cultural thing. So that's and also people there, dress in certain ways, right? They wear, the professional people tend to wear more relaxed Hawaiian type clothing. That's very common there. And so these are all questions of preference, and they are appropriately so. So if you like to have a lot of food while you're working in a workshop, why not? What's wrong with that? That's not going to violate any standards of ethics.
And with me personally, I think this is true for most other people, but it may not be. And it's that I kind of think of myself as a critical thinker, as a relatively rational person who kind of shouldn't, in my mind, shouldn't have these cultural norms deeply embedded in me. And I think that's just self-delusion on my part, because I too was raised in a certain culture, and there are things to wear or things to do or ways of acting that are very difficult for me when I go into another culture. Now, it's aided by the fact that I've visited a lot of places and stayed in a lot of places, so I've gotten much more accustomed to it. But just people eat foods that I can't bring myself to eat fat spiders.
Yes.
The way they do in Cambodia. I mean, it just and I know it's completely cultural. That doesn't get me out of it.
That's interesting. Yes, I think it's good when you place yourself in that situation. So I remember once eating it was at Singapore, an area that was the Indian area, India, where had their shops and a lot of restaurants, and so people were eating with their hands, and I was looking at my hands and I was thinking, these are really gross, and I'm going to put them in my food, and I'll put that in my mouth, and it's going to be squishy, and I'm going to be putting it in this sauce, and I'm going to be like, that seems, so you see, all of that sounds like, it feels like sort of disgusting. And then I realized, of course, Linda, this is all cultural. They're all doing this. They're all very comfortable. So that if you had been raised in that culture, you would be not thinking any of these thoughts right now.
Right.
That's very important, to be able to make those executive moves where you look at your thing and you sort of start laughing at it.
That's right.
Like, Linda, you're being ridiculous right now. Come on, you're showing how provincial you are.
Yeah, that's right. And a question that often arises for me, a deep background or foundational question, is how many of the things that I do or think or engage in or believe are cultural, without my knowledge, without my realizing that they're either cultural or have a large degree of of culture, cultural uniformity behind it. And I get a counter for that by going to other cultures, but also by reading about different times in history.
Yes, so that's that. Yes, let me just before we end this discussion on the three types of questions. We've talked a little bit about questions of procedure or fact, and we've talked a little bit about questions of preference, and we've talked about cultural preferences, and we've talked a little bit about relativism. Now, questions of judgment, I'd like to just narrow in on that category for a few minutes. In schooling, we tend, of course, to focus on questions of fact. So we give students fact one, fact two, fact. So we give them a lot of facts. And of course, all of these facts interrelate, but we usually don't help them see the interrelationships. And often teachers themselves don't know what these are. So, and sometimes we confuse questions of fact with questions of preference or judgment, as we've mentioned. So questions of judgment are almost entirely ignored, not only in schooling, but also in societies. And not, by that, I don't mean that we're not engaging in questions of judgment. We are engaging in them very frequently, but we're not doing it in a disciplined way. We're not aware that it's a question of judgment necessarily. And we don't really know how to approach questions of judgment in a disciplined way. So let's just take a question like this. Should euthanasia be legalized? Now, to answer that question, and to come up with a better answer of the possible answers, then we're going to have to make a number of intellectual moves. We're going to have to consider the viewpoint of the person who would want to engage in such a practice. So the person who wants to basically have the right to kill themselves. And we've got to, with intellectual empathy, understand the thinking and the feelings and the pain of such a person coming to such a point. And we have to do that in good faith. And we haven't done that, then we cannot say we've adequately answered the question. And now another dimension, so once we've done that, we've got to consider the legal implications. Because we're not asking, is it justified? We're not asking, is euthanasia justified in this case? We're asking whether it should be legalized. You can believe that it's justified and not want it to be legal because you're afraid that the legal system can't manage it properly. Can't manage that process. You don't trust the legal system. So you think that family members are going to easily be able to kill someone in their family. Well, you know, there are moves that you could make here. And legal systems are better and worse depending on the countries that we're talking about. So once you make something into law, you could, you know, someone could argue, then you've got a whole lot of cluster of problems or questions that you face. So you've got to, these are just some early easy moves that we've got to make if we're going to answer this question, should euthanasia be legalized adequately?
And let me say about education, stressing facts. And the role of facts. So I'm suspicious. I'm not suspicious of facts, of course, but I'm suspicious often of the role facts play in dialogue. In that, the extent of my understanding, I see very few substantive questions which are ever answered by stating a fact or even a group of facts. And often what people do is they say a fact as if that settles the matter, right? Like the question of euthanasia, you can say, but a person can say, euthanasia, that's killing someone. And that's a fact. But
Mhm.
you can't settle the question of whether euthanasia should be legalized or is okay by stating a fact like it's killing someone. Or
Mhm.
people sometimes, so I'm not going to be saying anything about whether abortion is justified or not, but people sometimes will say abortion is taking a life. Well, of course
Mhm.
that's true, but that doesn't settle the question of whether it's justified or should be legal or anything like
Right.
that. And as far as I can see, people resort to questions as a way of not having to confront what's really going on. I'm not saying always, but often. It's a way of stepping out of
Yeah.
the actual issue that
Mhm.
you're discussing.
Right. And in a way, what they're doing is they're saying, I'm unwilling to think through this question in a disciplined way.
Right.
So I'm going to make a move that will just knock you down. So
Right.
here's another one. My religion thinks it's wrong, so it's over. So if I ask a student on let's say in a class that I'm teaching, I ask the question, should euthanasia be legalized? The answer, no, because my religion says it's wrong.
Right. And that's a fact. Yeah.
And the grade is F,
Mhm.
because the person is they're making a move that they think means that they don't have to make any other moves.
Right. Right.
And actually their religious views are not relevant because this is not a religious question.
No, right. Yeah.
And they can say, well, yeah, because our religion says it's wrong, again, to kill yourself.
Mhm.
But then how does that take into account the suffering of the person who wants to die?
Mhm.
The person who wants to die, who would be able to get it done in a legal system,
Mhm.
is going to have to be suffering to a very high degree
Mhm.
and have to be cognizant of what they're doing, fully cognizant.
Mhm.
So you're saying to me, you don't have to think through that. You don't have to even consider that because your God says it's wrong.
Mhm. Or
But
the report of what your guide says.
exactly. So where are we getting those thoughts
Right.
from that
Right.
are attributed to God?
Mhm.
See,
Mhm.
and then suddenly it's like, well, somebody wrote them. Well, who
Mhm.
wrote them? Well, the hand of God. Wait a minute, what hand of God? As it turns out, it was actually a human being.
Mhm. Whole
And
bunch.
as soon as you say that, then it's, wait a minute, somebody wrote that down using their ideas out of their head. And you're telling me that that's going to trump
Mhm.
a person suffering a horrifying disease.
Mhm.
And as I say that, when I say that, the horrifying disease, I'm trying to be there. I'm trying to imagine that feeling of
Mhm.
wanting to die because you're in
Mhm.
so much pain. And if you can't do that when you answer such a question, then you are not, you're not in good faith
Right.
approaching the question.
Right. And I think kind of related to that, the way questions of fact or procedure, one system questions, and questions of judgment, multi-system procedures. I think that in many cases it's not all or nothing. It is about the boiling point of lead, but the role of experimentation shows that some things tend to become much more strongly questions of fact without necessarily going all the way toward that. I mean, Aristotle and Freud believed that watching violent films or tragedies gave you catharsis, and you were purged of your feelings of, for Aristotle, pity and fear, but that it helped you as become more accustomed to your life. And there have been lots of now experiments on that where it's been shown fairly conclusively that nothing like that happens, that in fact watching something that's violent induces a greater amount of violence in the person who watches it. So what that does for me, it means that catharsis, which was originally a multi-system question, let's think it through, how does it work out, but that the experimentation doesn't refute the idea of catharsis happening, but it gives a strong fact-based reason to doubt it. So, and I think it doesn't have to be about the catharsis one, but I think there are a lot of such questions. As you do more experimentation, it doesn't always get things all the way to yes or no, but it gets things all the way to, well, 90% of our evidence is on this side.
So if you take the question, does violence, let's say viewing violence, or in Aristotle's case, maybe reading about violence, if you're then you are, then that's kind of good for you because you're cathartic. That's one view.
Right.
And yet, so in other words, if the question then was, does viewing violence lead to violence? The answer for them was no, but the answer in fact is yes.
Yeah. And probably tends to be yes, which is.
Yeah, exactly. So not necessarily, obviously, you see, that's one of the problems with studies. It doesn't mean that every person who engages in watching something violent becomes violent.
Right.
It means that there's too much of a tendency in that direction to be comfortable with just allowing this. Anyone who's ever had a child and allowed them to watch violence on TV, and usually it's in cartoon form, and they can see their child engaging in the violence. I mean, especially, well, I'm hesitant to say, especially boys, because I'll get into trouble if I say that. But I do think that there are certain tendencies that can be called out in people, and there it's all right, and but it would not necessarily in other people. So then the important thing here for me is, or one important thing is that the questions of judgment are essential for us to be able to reason through, and there are better and worse answers to these questions.
Right.
And then I think we could begin to wrap this up and really go back to our earlier discussion on clusters of questions in the assignment that I gave, which was, if you ask the question, how should I live my life? That's a question of judgment. And I think that all critical thinking theory and discussions should lead us to live better somehow. And so we could ask, well, what are the big questions driving my life? What are the big questions I face in my life? And are these questions of judgment? And if so, how well is my judgment here? And then you really use these questions to gain leverage in our thinking. So if we're in a discussion with someone and they're racing, let's say you start to suddenly you're arguing about a category 1 question. It's a question of fact that you're arguing about. Are there any apples in the refrigerator? Well, I think there are 4. Now, the last time I looked, there were 3. I'm pretty sure there were 4. Well, why not just wait until we don't really know. We're on the way to the store, so we have to, we don't know the answer. So let's just say that we're gonna have to count them when we get home. People get into, big fights over things like this, whether there are any apples in the refrigerator. So if you're dealing with the question of fact, you can say, wait a minute, this is a question of fact. Can we just wait and answer this later? Why are we discussing this when we don't have the facts? And then, or is this a question of preference? Wait a minute, are you imposing your preferences upon me? Am I imposing them upon mine on you? Or is this really a question of judgment where we have enough data to answer the question? So in other words, questions of judgment, by the way, presuppose questions of fact, because if we're dealing with a complex question of judgment, then they're going to be questions we need to answer before we answer those questions. And we're going to have data. So if we're asking a question, let's just go back to, should euthanasia be legalized? and let's say that we agree that people should be allowed to end their own lives, all things being equal. Let's just say we think they should have that right.
Mhm.
But then we say, but I don't really know how the legal system would handle this.
Mhm.
In other words, I don't even know how this would work in the legal system. How would this become law, and what would it look like? You see, then now I'm out of my realm of knowledge.
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
I can't, maybe at that point, I can't really say whether the legal system is going to be able to handle this
Indeed, yeah, right.
issue.
That's
So we can say, I understand this in dealing with this question. I can answer this part of it, but I really can't answer that part of it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's I'm going to say something very speculative right now. But you said, I think exactly right, that questions of judgment presuppose prior questions of fact. And I'm wondering if the reverse is true, that questions of fact presuppose prior questions of judgment. So
That's an interesting question. You could probably say yes if you say at some point they had to be researched again as questions of, because we didn't know the answer.
right. But even aside from historical investigation, I mean, our most mundane mathematical procedures rest on 5 axioms of arithmetic, and axioms are assumptions. They're not ever proved. So, and what we say about physics, kind of hard and fast kinds of things, rest on Newton's laws of motion, which turn out not to be quite right, have to be adjusted by relativity theory. So they rest on these reasoned judgments, which are themselves not proved, but are axiomatic for what follows. So, yeah.
Yes, I could see how that, that definitely, I could see that.
Yeah.
So I think for practical purposes, to wrap that up, we ask, are there any facts that we already know are agreed upon?
Indeed.
And if there are, we can count on those as facts.
Right.
Then is that as far as we have to go, or do we have to go further and now get other facts having to do with other parts of the question or other points of view that have to be considered in answering this question? And that, by the way, is one of the hallmarks of the question of judgment. There is more than one way of looking at the facts. So there's more than one point of view relevant here. And we have to think within all of the relevant viewpoints and with all of the relevant data to answer it. And if we leave any of that out, then we really can't justify our answer unless we just say, I just don't know the part. I don't know that. And if you don't know it and you can't find it, or it's not reasonable to think that you should find it in context, then you should just make that move. That's the part that I don't know.
Right. Indeed. Yeah.
So I think, Gerald, we should now wrap this up. We had intentions of covering more, of course, and we can continue the question series. We've, in this session, mainly been focusing again on clusters of questions. We've talked a little bit about student application to the classroom, and we've really been focusing primarily then on going deeper in 3 types of questions. And we'll go into prior questions and conceptual questions in our next session. So, Gerald, thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. I've enjoyed it very much. It's been interesting, and I'm just very pleased that we got to go into 3 types of questions in a much deeper way than I have before, and in conjunction with one another.
It's always enjoyable. The time always flies by, and it's just thrilling to be able to build on one another's understandings and to explore some ideas that we don't always get a chance to explore in working in our introductory sessions. So I'm going to,
and exploring them with you together is different from exploring them in my own mind when I'm sitting all by myself. It's quite different. Yeah, much more fruitful.
Yes, yes. This is why working together with people who are trying to develop their thinking is so important.
Mhm.
And so with that, we'll say goodbye for now. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. And thank you again, Gerald.
Bye, Linda. Thank you. Bye.